I was invited here to talk a little bit about how I see the nexus of cybersecurity and world economic developments. I mean, cybersecurity, as you know, I mean, I don't need to go this for you, but it's also a global movement. It's not constrained to particular geographical areas, and of course, it's something which tends to its attractions tend to move not only to public units or to data transaction by public administrators or by different sort of data which concerns larger societal functions, like, for instance, smart metering. They're also attractive about what is going on in corporations and what sort of data that is being transferred by inside companies and between companies. Now, if you look at overall world economic development now, I think it's fair to say that with the past 2 or 3 decades, with an enormous expansion of global economic integration across the world, that integration itself has been driven by 2 factors. The first one was the rise of Asia, and the other one was the fragmentation of various supply chains, especially in electronics and information technology products. This is the 2 factors that really have driven the huge wave of economic integration in the world in the past 2 and 3 decades. Now, these factors themselves are now being pretty much exhausted in terms of what they can deliver in more economic integration, and we see a fairly significant shift inside companies as well as between countries, where the fragmentation of the value chains, and especially the fragmentation of the service value chains, are becoming the determinant factors between what sort of expansion we are seeing in cross-border integration on trade and investment sides in the world today. And here we talk about both services like, for instance, computer services or construction services, but also services that are about to deliver on the retail side a particular data service to a client, for instance, an e-commerce service or indeed an electronic payment service. E-commerce today roughly represent $10 trillion of the world economy. We are seeing, as I said, a development where the services content of trade and the services content of production is increasing very rapidly, and as a consequence of that, the data content of trade and the data content of production is also increasing very much. There are different sort of studies that try to estimate the actual data content of manufacturing production on a general aggregate level, and they're going to come to different sort of conclusions, but pointing to somewhere between 5 to 10% of manufacturing production, where the value is actually created by data, not by the other elements of production. So the point here is then, and this is my first point, with the expansion of the world economy along these trends, cybersecurity is going to become vastly more important for companies to protect assets, to protect business models, and of course to protect information they have about clients. But there's a flip side of the coin, and that flip side of the coin is that given the vast amount of value being generated by data, and especially by then fragmentation of data value chains, there's also great capacity for cybersecurity regulations to damage economic value. They can damage economic value of the same kind that cybersecurity attacks can damage economic value being generated in these new production networks. So I think that's my first point, that we need to be very cautious and very aware of the different consequences that both cybersecurity attacks and that regulations or protections against cybersecurity attacks can have on the actual value that is being produced on the market today. My second point is that when you look around the world today, you're not going to be impressed by the quality of many of the regulations that travels under the name of cybersecurity regulations. You will actually find that a lot of governments around the world they're putting cybersecurity as a headline of a regulation which actually deals with something else. Protecting cybersecurity is a profoundly legitimate interest on the part of everyone, but what we're seeing being sneaked in under cybersecurity regulations in the world today are stuff that has nothing to do with cybersecurity itself, but it has to do with promoting industrial policy interests, perhaps even performing protectionist services for local producers. So to give you a couple of examples, we see an increasing number of countries in the world that are introducing forced data localization in the spirit of trying to improve the capacity for cybersecurity. We even see that some countries are, in specific sectors, introducing forced localization also of hardware production. We see that some governments are introducing regulations which prevents companies to fragment their own supply chains, and this is both for software and for hardware. And what I'm talking about here is not only what governments perhaps in societies where regulations have not matured as much as they've done in other parts are doing. We're also talking about what fairly mature societies are doing, like in this case, for instance, Canada. Canada has introduced a legislation which in effect is going to prevent vendors that are part of building IT infrastructure to use to fragment their supply chains and basically take in supplies to them that are not from Canada and not done by Canadian people from Canada carrying a Canadian passport. A third example is that governments are introducing specific standards for local encryption methodologies, and some of these encryptions are performing in most of the times in conjunction with standards that you can find in other countries too, but in some countries you will find that they're using completely different standard for encryption, which is going to make it vastly more difficult to actually integrate with that particular market for data services. And finally, we're seeing also, looking at on the payment side, we're seeing governments introducing legislations which in effect creates monopolies for local companies when it comes to process electronic payment transactions. Many of these policies themselves have a huge content of trying to perform an industrial policy service to local producers. They are there in order to protect against competition coming from abroad, not specifically to deal with a cybersecurity risk. My final conclusion then is that I think we need to be much more creative, much more imaginative in trying to find ways for the EU and for other countries to take leadership in shaping international rules for what can be accomplished in this nexus between cybersecurity and industrial policy. It's going to be a lot more difficult to shape international rules and standards for proper cybersecurity policy. But what I would like to see here is more attention being focused to the extent to which that cybersecurity regulations in the world have the capacity to fraction and to destroy a lot of economic value that can be created in modern economic value chains. What we see here, what many governments are doing, it's a very specious type of approach, because in normal ways you cannot introduce protectionist mechanisms, or you cannot promote industrial policy in a discriminatory way without violating the commitments you've made in trade agreements in the World Trade Organization, or indeed in bilateral trade agreements you've done with other countries. But as soon as you put national security interest as the label for what you're doing, you're going to apply more of a self-judge test, whether this is a violation of the commitment you've done, or if it's a legitimate departure from the commitments that you actually have. And this is the problem. I mean, most of these things would have been the subject of a lot of trade litigation if they hadn't carried the national security tagline for what when governments have performed them. But the fact that that particular tagline is there basically makes it an unregulated phenomenon in the world economy today. And on current trends, we're going to see that this type of actions are going to destroy far more economic value than they're doing today. Thank you.